Have you ever wondered why the one who seemed most silent ends up echoing loudest in your conscience? It is because there are men whose hearts were forged in solitude, men who did not arrive to possess, but to offer, not flowers, but presents, not promises, but principles. And when such a man loves, it is not with noise, nor with need, but with a terrifying stillness. The kind of stillness only found in a soul that has walked through fire and never begged for rescue. A Stoic's heart does not burn in chaos. It glows in control. Yet some play with such a man. She may not mean to, at first. She may have mistaken his restraint for passivity, his silence for uncertainty, his loyalty for leverage. She may have thought he could be bent toward her mood, her wounds, her shadows, without ever tending to her own. She didn't understand. The Stoic is not unmoved because he cannot feel. He is unmoved because he has already bled and chosen to transmute pain into poise. To play with a Stoic's heart is to tamper with a soul that has already made peace with being alone. He did not need her laughter to feel joy, nor her validation to feel real. But when he gave her his gaze, it wasn't just affection, it was clarity. It was presence. It was the sacred decision to make space for another without losing himself. And that is something few women know how to receive. Especially the ones still haunted by the ghosts of fathers who never looked them in the eye, or lovers who did, only while undressing them. You see, the Stoic's love is not performative. It is not a show, nor is it ever designed to chase or convince. His love is principle-bound, rooted in discernment. If he steps toward you, it is not because he's desperate. It's because you passed the silent trial of his intuition. And when that is betrayed, when that trust is gambled with, it's not just heartbreak she brings upon herself. It is regret. Regret born not of losing a man, but of losing access to a mirror that once reflected her highest self. She will feel it long after the game's end, because something deep in her psyche remembers. The way he looked at her, not to possess, not to tame, but to see, truly see. And that gaze, once gone, becomes a ghost, one that haunts her in the quiet. It will come for her, not in the arms of another man, but in the absence of meaning, those arms fail to hold, because nothing compares to being known by someone who expected nothing but truth from you. No flattery, no seduction, just soul. But here is the unbearable truth. Not all women are ready to be seen like that. Some prefer the echo chamber of men they can control, men who respond to tantrums, men who mistake pain for passion, men who are still at war with themselves and thus become easy to conquer. But the Stoic? He is a fortress. And what she may have mistaken for coldness was discipline. What she may have called distant was devotion to his own code, to his integrity, to the path of inner mastery, a path forged not in the warmth of attention, but in the solitude of trials. That is what makes his affection sacred. He gives it with full awareness. He chooses not by impulse, but alignment. So when a woman plays with that, when she toys with his consistency, mocks his stillness, tests his patience with chaos disguised as passion, she is not proving her power. She is proving her unworthiness of the very calm she unconsciously craves. For only the calmest man can contain the storm inside a wounded woman. But most wounded women don't know how to receive calm. They only know how to provoke it. They shake the tree, thinking if it doesn't bend, it doesn't love. They test him, thinking if he walks away, he was never invested. But the Stoic knows better. He knows that to engage in chaos is to betray his nature. He knows that some wars are won by never entering the battlefield. So when he leaves, he does so without a trace, not to punish, but to preserve. And then the regret begins, because when the Stoic leaves, he leaves in totality. He does not stalk her stories. He does not write long-winded letters. He does not seek revenge or closure. His silence is not a weapon. It is a verdict, a final act of love toward himself. And in that silence, she meets her reflection, not the one he once saw in her, but the one she tried to hide. The manipulative, the reactive, the wounded child in a woman's body who never learned how to sit with love that didn't bleed for her. Now she bleeds, but not because he made her. He didn't need to. He simply withdrew the mirror. And in its absence, she no longer knows what she is. For the man who sees your soul without demanding your body is the rarest kind. And when you lose that, the echo is eternal. And so it begins, the long unraveling, not with screams or shattering glass, but with a silence so vast it drowns. A silence she once mistook for indifference now reveals itself as the only truth that ever existed. For what she called emotionless was actually containment, the sacred art of not letting chaos contaminate clarity. He had boundaries, not barriers. He had self-respect, not detachment. But in a world obsessed with instant validation, she couldn't see the value in stillness. Now, in the aftermath, she begins to. The memories don't come in order. They return like fragments, piercing and precise. The way he looked at her when she wasn't speaking, not scanning her for usefulness, not consuming her for thrill, just witnessing, present, unwavering. The way his hand didn't grasp, but held. The way his absence of drama made her feel safe, until her own chaos couldn't sit with peace. The way he chose truth over tension, even when it cost him the moment. And the worst of all realizations, he never needed to explain himself. Because a Stoic doesn't argue to prove, he walks away to preserve. His silence is not cowardice, it is consequence. It is the withdrawal of a sacred offering from one who proved unworthy of it. And now, she sits in the cold. Not because he abandoned her, but because she banished herself from the warmth of his inner world by playing games he had transcended long ago. That's what she never understood. He wasn't playing the same game. He wasn't trying to win her. He was offering something rare, a partnership, not a performance. But she was still dancing with her shadows, still projecting her wounds, still hoping that the next emotional explosion would draw him closer, not drive him further. She had not yet faced her own animus, the masculine within, that storm of unmet longing, father hunger, and secret resentment. So she projected it onto him, demanding he play both the role of lover and savior. But the Stoic man will never be your father. He will not rescue you from yourself. He will not mistake your chaos for passion or your manipulation for need. He will not sacrifice his values to stay, because his self-respect is older than your fears. It was forged in the fires of nights spent alone with his shadow, confronting the very demons you pretend don't exist. And when he senses your games, he does not fight them. He honors them by exiting them, not out of cruelty, but because he knows, until you meet your own unconscious, no man can ever meet you fully. And that is the unbearable truth. To love a Stoic is to love yourself enough to rise, to meet him in stillness, to understand that presence is not passivity and boundaries are not rejection, to grow beyond the drama you once used to feel significant, to be still enough to be seen, naked not in body, but in essence. But few women are ready for that. Most are still dancing with the ghost of a man who never stayed, and punishing every real one for it. Most are still clinging to the myth that a man should prove his love through suffering, not sovereignty. But the Stoic has no interest in bleeding for your approval. He is not here to earn love through pain. He is love in form, disciplined, discerning, divine in direction. And when you try to manipulate that, it doesn't break him. It reveals you. And then he leaves, not to abandon, but to liberate, to remove himself from the theater of your ego, to grant you the space to meet your reflection, not through his words, but through his absence. Because when the Stoic leaves, the echo is not in what he says, but in what he no longer allows. The silence becomes the mirror, and in it, you either awaken or repeat, and she will try to repeat. She will seek him in others, in the smooth-talking poet, in the wild-eyed artist, in the emotionally available but spiritually unrooted men who claim to feel deeply, yet vanish at the first demand for depth. But none of them will reflect her like he did. None of them will hold the masculine line while letting her chaos pass through. None of them will challenge her ego while honoring her soul, because they don't know her soul. They only know how to react to her pain. But the Stoic? He didn't react. He witnessed. He held. Not to control, not to chase, but to mirror. And that is why she cannot forget. Not because of what he did, but because of what he refused to become in the face of her tests. And now, her tests no longer work. For the man she once played with has become the standard she cannot match. The archetype that haunts every shallow interaction. The calm she can no longer create within herself. And that regret, though silent, is permanent. Not because she lost him, but because she finally sees what it means to meet someone, and how rarely she ever did. There is a precise kind of ache reserved for the one who awakened too late, not because time ran out, but because she wasted it, trying to provoke something that was already pure. The Stoic did not come to be unraveled. He came whole, and when he offered himself, it was not as a puzzle, but as a pillar, silent, firm, centered. But some women are drawn only to the chase, not the choice. They confuse friction with fire. They need resistance to feel desired. So when he did not argue, when he did not flinch, when he refused to compete with the ghosts she carried, she called him distant. But what she didn't know was this: the Stoic doesn't play the part of the wounded boy. He is not here to repeat your patterns. He has already broken his. His heart is not up for ransom to prove he's real. It simply is, unshaken, unmoved by performance, unwilling to beg. And so, when she tested him, when she pulled back to see if he would chase, withheld to see if he would crack, accused to see if he would bend, he did nothing. Because the one who has tamed his own darkness does not chase yours. That is the paradox. The more you demand from a Stoic to prove himself, the more invisible you become to him. Not because he lacks feeling, but because he feels on a plane where noise cannot reach. He sees behind the mask, behind the tactic, into the ache beneath it all. But he knows that healing cannot be forced. He knows that chaos cannot be coddled into transformation. He will not carry you across the threshold you refuse to see. So he simply steps back, not to teach you a lesson, but because his soul speaks in silence. He does not retreat to punish. He retreats to protect himself and the sanctity of the love he came to offer, a love that does not waver under pressure. a love that demands its equal, not in perfection, but in presence. But presence is unbearable to the unready. To stand in front of a man who asks for no masks, who listens without interruption, who sees the patterns repeating before you even speak them, that kind of man is dangerous to the unhealed feminine, because he cannot be seduced by drama. He cannot be lured by chaos. He cannot be controlled by threat or withheld affection. And for the woman who's only known love through pain, this kind of man is confusing. She will poke. She will test. She will try to recreate the only dynamic she has known. One where love is earned through suffering, chased through withdrawal, proven through power games. And when he refuses to engage, she will spiral. She will claim he is cold, detached, unavailable. But deep down, she knows the truth. He simply saw her, all of her. And still, he didn't flinch. And that terrified her more than anything, because no one had ever seen her before, not without agenda, not without need, not without trying to conquer her body or cage her chaos. He only stood there, calm and open, with no desire to own, only to meet. And that is what she feared most. Meeting. Truly meeting. Because to be met is to be known, and to be known is to risk being unworthy. So instead, she chose the familiar script. She played, she pulled, she provoked. But this man, this Stoic, was not a character in her drama. He had written his own story long before she arrived, a story of rising from the ashes, not blaming the fire, a story of integrity over intensity, of devotion over desperation. And now she realizes she was never ready for a man like that, not because she wasn't worthy, but because she hadn't yet faced the parts of her that kept pulling her away from love and calling it fate. She hadn't yet done the shadow work, the excavation of the little girl inside her, still screaming for safety in the form of attention. She hadn't yet learned that love is not a test to be passed, but a presence to be kept. And now, in his absence, that truth echoes louder than any words could. There is no text to send that would call him back. No apology eloquent enough to rebuild the bridge she burned, not with fire, but with ego. Because a Stoic's heart, once betrayed, does not close in bitterness, it closes in clarity. He does not hold resentment, he simply moves forward. And the most agonizing thing for her? He does so without anger, because anger is still an attachment. But he is free. And freedom, once tasted by a man of depth, is never traded for chaos again. Even if that chaos is beautiful, even if it once wore the face of love, he will remember her not with hatred, but as the final lesson, the one who reminded him that love must be mirrored, not managed, chosen, not chased, held, not handled. And so, she is left not with punishment, but with the silence of his absence, the silence that demands she finally meet herself. She stares at the door he never slammed, but quietly closed. And though the world may never see her grief, it spills out in private, not in tears, but in questions. Why didn't he fight for me? Why didn't he try harder? But the deeper question, the one she avoids like flame, is this: why did I need him to fight at all? Because if love requires war, what are you really trying to win? The Stoic man understands this. He knows that love should never be reduced to a contest between egos. That intimacy is not a performance, but a mirror, one that shows you everything you've denied in yourself. He does not approach love with weapons or wounds. He comes unarmed, and that, for many, is far more threatening than rage. He never tried to change her. That's what haunts her most. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He didn't retaliate when she accused or panic when she pulled away. He simply witnessed, and in that stillness, he offered her something few ever will: the chance to grow, to evolve, to meet herself in the presence of a man who had already met himself. But when she chose instead to provoke, to push, to punish, he let go. Not out of weakness, but from the deepest strength. Because only a man who has faced the dragon of his own shadow can walk away from the drama of another's. Only a man who has made peace with loneliness can choose self-respect over codependency. Only a man who understands the impermanence of life can release what doesn't rise with him, even if he once dreamed of building with her. And yes, he did dream. Not in fantasy, but in vision. He saw her strength. He saw her softness beneath the survival. He saw her brilliance clouded by patterns not yet healed. He saw her potential, not as something to fix, but something to witness into bloom. But she had not yet chosen to bloom. She was still addicted to winter, to the cold comfort of being pursued, of holding power in the withholding, of measuring love by how hard a man breaks for her. But he would not break. He had already been broken, and he rebuilt himself not as a martyr, but as a mirror. And now, that mirror is gone. Now she walks through her days, encountering reflections that flatter, but do not reveal. Men who praise her beauty, but never ask about her wounds. Men who entertain her moods, but never challenge her patterns. Men who stay, not because they see her, but because they don't even see themselves. But none of them are him. Not because he was perfect, but because he was present. Because he held a standard that called her higher, even when she tried to drag him lower. Because he asked nothing but truth, and she gave him tactics. Because he offered consistency, and she responded with tests. And now she understands what she lost. The masculine isn't the man who dominates her, controls her, or submits to her whims. The masculine is the one who contains, not through force, but through presence. Through the sacred discipline of a man who does not make his emotions her responsibility and does not let hers dictate his direction. The masculine is the one who holds stillness when storms rage, and she was the storm, but he didn't try to tame her. He only offered the calm, and when she turned her back on that, she thought he would chase. She thought he would roar or collapse. She thought he would fall apart like the boys before him. Instead, he stood still, and in that stillness, she heard the sound of her own unrest, her own unmet self, her own ache to be held by a man who would never trade truth for proximity. And now she knows. She was not abandoned. She was simply seen. And sometimes that is the greatest heartbreak of all. To realize that someone saw every scar and still said yes, and you turned away, thinking you needed more, thinking love should hurt, or that control was power, or that peace was weakness. But the Stoic is never weak. He is the storm tamed, the lion resting, the sword sheathed. He is the sacred masculine made flesh, and she will never forget the way he made her feel, not because of what he did, but because of what he didn't allow. He didn't allow her fear to rule. He didn't allow her wounds to dictate the dynamic. He didn't allow the past to rewrite the present. He only asked one thing: truth. And when it was withheld, he withdrew not just his body, but the space he had once carved out in his life for her becoming. That is what she mourns, not the man, but the version of herself she glimpsed in his gaze and never became. Time moves differently after a Stoic's departure. Not slower, not faster, but deeper. Every hour expands, filled with echoes of what was unsaid. Not because he left without warning, but because his presence carried a clarity she never thought she'd lose. A clarity that, once known, makes confusion unbearable. Now, even the silence tastes like consequence, not punishment. No, he does not believe in retribution. The Stoic does not inflict pain to teach. He simply removes himself from environments where his peace is not protected. That is his form of justice, departure, not destruction. And this too she misread. She thought a man who didn't fight must not have cared. But he did care. He cared enough to not participate in her destruction. He cared enough to not play the role of the savior. He knew that stepping in to rescue her from the consequences of her own unconsciousness would only rob her of the awakening she needed most. And so he chose what few men do, to love her in silence, from a distance, through absence. And it is in that absence she now meets herself, no longer through his reflection, but through her own ruin. She sees the strategies she once called strength, emotional withdrawal, passive aggression, baiting him with silence. She sees the power plays she mistook for boundaries, the ultimatums disguised as communication, the tests she gave instead of trust. She sees how every game was a mask, not to protect herself from him, but from her own vulnerability. She never expected him to leave, not really. She expected him to break like the others, to finally raise his voice, to chase, to prove that she was worth fighting for by forgetting what he stood for. But the Stoic does not fight to be chosen. He chooses with precision. And once the alignment is broken, once the mirror is cracked, he does not tape it back together for comfort. He lets it go. Because he knows that what breaks once through betrayal will eventually shatter through time, and he refuses to rebuild something that was never real. Because to the Stoic, love must be real, or not at all. He does not need perfection, but he demands sincerity. And when sincerity is replaced with games, he does not retaliate, he releases. And now, as she sits in the hollow of that release, she begins to see the truth. He was not cold, he was clean. Clean in his energy, clean in his presence, clean in his communication. There was no manipulation in his love, no hidden motives, no performance behind the patience. He simply was. And she did not know how to receive a man who required no chaos to connect. The feminine that is unhealed will often flee the very peace she prays for, not because she doesn't want it, but because she doesn't recognize herself without dysfunction. And that's what he took with him, not just his presence, but her identity within the dynamic. She doesn't know who she is when she's not chasing attention, correcting behavior, managing emotion. The Stoic didn't need to be managed, and that terrified her, because managing love was the only form of intimacy she had ever known. She was never taught that a man could hold space without trying to fix her, that he could listen without trying to win, that he could walk away without trying to wound. She didn't understand that some men protect their hearts, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Because not every man guards his love with iron. Some guard it with silence. And in that silence, she now drowns. Not because he cursed her, but because he didn't. He did not need revenge. He did not need to tarnish her name. He simply left the field. He walked away from the war, and in doing so, made her face what she never could, her own addiction to conflict, to crisis, to the highs and lows of a love that never rooted. He was the first man who rooted, and now, all the men she meets blow like wind through the branches of her life. Loud, transient, directionless. They love loudly, then leave quickly. They match her drama, mirror her wounds, compete in her chaos, but none of them can stand in stillness. None of them offer the solidity he did. None of them contain. And so she looks back, not because she wants to return, but because part of her never left. Part of her still lives in the version of herself that was seen by a man who required no decoration, no drama, no distortion. A man who saw the woman beneath the warrior, the soul beneath the survival, the truth beneath the tantrum. And she wonders now, in quiet hours, who she could have become if she had just stayed soft, stayed real, stayed accountable, because the Stoic man does not fall in love with perfection. He falls for what is true. And when you offer him anything less, when you choose pride over presence, performance over vulnerability, he does not punish. He simply disappears, like a ghost that never had to haunt you, because your own conscience will do that just fine. There comes a moment, always, when the echo becomes unbearable. It happens late at night, often without warning. In the stillness between distractions, in the soft ache of a song that once played in his presence, in the curve of a scent that no longer lingers on her skin. That is when the mirror reappears. Not the literal one on the wall, but the psychic mirror. The one he held up with his steady gaze, asking silently, "Can you meet yourself here without masks?" At the time, she couldn't, because meeting herself meant unraveling. It meant sitting with the raw, unedited versions of who she was. The child who clung, the woman who controlled, the soul that feared abandonment so deeply, she manifested it before anyone could choose to stay. But he stayed longer than most, until her resistance became louder than her heart. And now, she faces the consequence not of losing him, but of remaining unchanged. For time does not heal what pride defends, and the longer she waits to face the shadow he illuminated, the deeper it buries its teeth. The Stoic understood this, that growth requires confrontation, and love without growth is not love, but bondage. He would not bind himself. He would not become another casualty of her inner war, because he did not enter her life to complete her. He came to mirror her wholeness, the part of her buried under resentment and old stories, the part of her that longs to be chosen not for her curves or charm, but for her character. But she did not choose herself, and so she could not choose him. That is the brutal beauty of a Stoic's love. It does not lower itself to be accepted. It waits, patiently, quietly, until it sees whether the other is willing to rise. And if she cannot rise, it leaves. Not with anger, not with warning, but with finality. She thought love was endurance. He knew love was alignment. She thought tests would prove his depth. He knew tests only revealed her fear. She thought he would stay, just to prove her worth. He stayed until she proved her resistance to becoming worthy of the kind of love he embodied. And now, she watches him from afar, not in flesh, but in thought, in the choices he would have made, in the peace he carried like armor, in the absence of his presence, which weighs more than any man she's held since. They are not him. They text back quickly, laugh easily, flatter endlessly, but none of them challenge her projections. None of them hold space for truth. None of them see past her curated identity into the deep, unspoken ache behind her eyes, because they do not know her soul. They know how to flirt with her edges, but not how to sit at her center. They don't ask the questions that matter. They don't notice the hesitation in her voice when she talks about her father. They don't ask why she never cries, or why she only feels powerful when she's in control. But he noticed. Without asking, he saw it all. And still he stayed, for a time, until it became clear that she loved the idea of being seen, but not the reality of being known. Because to be known requires surrender. It demands honesty. It shatters the illusion of control, and she wasn't ready to shatter. Not then. But now, after the silence has settled into her bones, after the echoes have shaped themselves into understanding, she begins to crack, not with despair, but with realization. That her tests were not boundaries, that her silence was not strength, that her push-pull tactics did not make her valuable. They made her avoidant of the one thing he required, reciprocity. He did not need her to be perfect. He only needed her to be present, to meet him, not halfway, but in truth, to own her fears, not weaponize them, to stay when the impulse was to flee, to soften when the urge was to control. But she didn't. And now, she bears the burden of what could have been, not as fantasy, but as fracture. She fractured something sacred, not in him, in herself. Because now she knows, a man like him does not return. Not because he cannot forgive, but because he knows better than to re-enter the house he was once exiled from. He does not knock twice. He does not plead for second chances. He walks through life like the river, steady, sure, and always forward. And in his wake, she rebuilds, not out of hope to have him back, but out of the slow, painful knowing that she was not ready, but could have been. That the version of her he once loved still lives inside, beneath the armor, behind the old wounds, waiting to be claimed. Not for him, for her. Because the Stoic never saves you. He only shows you. And once you've been shown, you can never again pretend you do not see. She wakes now with a different kind of hunger, not for attention, not for validation, but for peace. The very peace she once mistook as distance in him. The kind of peace that can't be faked or bought or chased. It can only be earned, slowly, quietly, in the long hours of honest self-inquiry, when no one is watching and no mask remains. This is what his absence taught her. You cannot receive what you will not become. She wanted his loyalty, but withheld her trust. She wanted his presence, but fled intimacy. She wanted his depth, but played at the surface. And now, she understands what she once mocked, the gravity of a man who refuses to abandon himself for the comfort of someone else. He was not performing masculinity. He was masculinity, distilled and whole. No bravado, no games, no fractured boy in a man's shell seeking a mother in disguise. Just a man who had done the work, and because he had, he could not, would not, be dragged back into a dynamic where only one person was willing to grow. She thought he would bend. She thought his steadiness was negotiable. But a Stoic's heart bends only for truth. It does not contort for ego or twist for convenience. It moves with principle, not passion. And that principle is what held her long after he let go.